old high school auditorium always smelled the same. A strange cocktail of floor wax, old paper, and the faint, ghostly scent of 1,000 past performances. Tonight that familiar smell was cut through by the warm, buttery aroma of popcorn being sold in the lobby for the annual community talent show. It was an event that marked the end of summer, a tradition as reliable as the first crisp autumn leaf. Families filed in, finding their usual spots on the slightly sticky, faded red seats of the auditorium. The air hummed with a low, expectant buzz, a mixture of excited chatter from children and the tired, patient conversations of their parents. Up near the ceiling, massive dust motes danced in the beams of the stage lights, looking like tiny, silent stars in their own little galaxy. On stage, a teenage band was just finishing their set. They were called the Thunderbolts, a name that promised far more energy than they delivered. The lead singer, a lanky boy with hair falling over his eyes, screeched out the final line of a classic rock song, his voice cracking on the high note. The guitarist, trying to be dramatic, swung his instrument around his neck, but the strap slipped, and he almost dropped it. He caught it with a clumsy lurch, his face flushing a deep red. The song ended with a chaotic crash of cymbals and a final feedback-laced twang from the amplifier. There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a wave of polite, almost pitying applause. The Thunderbolts bowed, looking relieved it was over, shuffled off the stage into the relative darkness of the wings. Backstage was a different world. It was a narrow, cluttered corridor painted a scuffed battleship gray. The air was thicker here, warmer, and filled with the nervous energy of the waiting performers. A young woman in a leotard was stretching her leg against a concrete wall, her face a mask of concentration. A man in a top hat and a slightly too tight tuxedo was muttering to himself, running a deck of cards through his fingers over and over again. Parents were giving last-minute words of encouragement, adjusting costumes, and wiping away smears of dirt from small, restless hands. It was a controlled chaos, a place where dreams and stage fright mingled in the humid air, and in the middle of it all, sitting on a sturdy wooden crate that probably held stage cables, was a little girl. She was about 7 years old, small for her age, with a thatch of unruly brown hair that kept falling into her eyes. She was wearing a simple, pale yellow dress, the kind with a little bit of lace on the collar that had seen better days. On her cheek was a faint smudge of what looked like chocolate, a remnant of an earlier snack. While everyone else around her was a whirlwind of motion and anxiety, she was perfectly still. She wasn't practicing a dance routine or humming a tune. She just sat there, her hands folded neatly in her lap, holding a single, folded piece of paper. The paper was soft and worn at the edges, as if it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. She looked at it every so often, not with the nervousness of someone trying to memorize lines, but with the quiet reverence of a person holding a treasure. Out in the auditorium, the judges were watching the stagehands clear the band's equipment. The judges' table was set up just below the stage, a long table covered with a black tablecloth, 3 bottles of water, and neat stacks of scoring sheets. In the center sat Mr. Harrison, a man who had been the head judge for this event for as long as anyone could remember. He was a retired drama teacher from the local community college, a man with a neatly trimmed white beard and a perpetually unimpressed expression. He had directed dozens of plays in his time, from Shakespeare to modern musicals, and he had seen every kind of talent, and a far greater amount of mediocrity. He loved the arts, but he had little patience for amateur hour. He sighed, taking a slow sip of his lukewarm water, and tapped his pen on the table. Beside him, Ms. Albright, the gentle music teacher from the elementary school, gave him a small, sympathetic smile. She loved this event, loved seeing the kids get up there and try their best no matter the result. The third judge, a young city councilman named Mr. Evans, who was probably required to be there, was scrolling through his phone, barely looking up. Well, that was enthusiastic, Miss Albright said, trying to find a positive spin. Mr. Harrison grunted. Enthusiasm is no substitute for talent, my dear, or for a properly tuned guitar. He jotted down a quick score on the sheet for the Thunderbolts, not even bothering to be discreet about it. He was already looking forward to the end of the night, to the quiet of his living room and a cup of hot tea. He had seen it all before. The off-key singers, the clumsy magicians, the dance troupes with more heart than skill. It was the same show every year, just with a different set of faces. He settled back in his chair, his body language screaming boredom. The announcer, a cheerful woman with a bright pink blazer, walked back onto the stage. And a wonderful thank you to the Thunderbolts for that. Electric performance, she said, her voice echoing through the hall. There was another smattering of applause. All right, folks, we have a few more amazing acts for you tonight. Our next contestant is a young lady who is going to share a special song with us. Please give a warm welcome to Faye. The name was spoken into the microphone, and it hung in the air for a moment. Faye. It was a simple, old-fashioned name. The applause that followed was polite but sparse, a soft patter of hands rather than a roar. People shifted in their seats, some turning to whisper to their neighbors. A little girl? They had just sat through a loud rock band. A child's song felt like a step down, a filler act. Mr. Harrison looked up from his notes, his eyebrows raised. A little girl. He let out an almost inaudible sigh and picked up his pen again. He could already picture it. A nervous child, a parent, just offstage mouthing the words, a simple, off-key rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle Little Star. He wrote Faye on a fresh scoring sheet, his handwriting sharp and neat. He was ready to get this over with. Backstage, a woman with a clipboard knelt down in front of the little girl on the crate. "That's you, sweetie," she said, her voice soft. "You're on now." Faye looked up, her eyes wide and clear. She nodded slowly, not saying a word. She carefully folded the piece of paper and held it tightly in one small fist. She slid off the crate, her yellow dress fluttering around her knees. She didn't run or skip like other children might have. She walked with a slow, deliberate pace toward the bright rectangle of light that marked the stage entrance. The magician watched her go, a look of pity on his face. He knew how tough it could be up there, especially for a kid, as Faye stepped out of the wings and into the spotlight. The sheer size of the stage seemed to swallow her. The auditorium, which had felt cozy from the wings, now seemed like a vast, dark cavern. The single spotlight was hot and blinding, making it impossible to see anything beyond the first few rows of seats. She was a tiny, solitary figure in a sea of darkness. She walked to the center of the stage, her small shoes making soft, scuffing sounds on the wooden floor. The microphone, on its tall metal stand, was way too high for her. She reached up with both hands, her small fingers struggling to get a grip. She pulled down, and the metal clanked loudly, the sound echoing through the now silent hall. A few quiet chuckles came from the back of the room. Mr. Harrison shook his head almost imperceptibly and made a small note on his paper. Lacks stage presence. Awkward. He was already composing the gentle but firm critique he would give later. He leaned back, ready to endure the next few minutes. The audience was quiet, a sea of shadowy faces waiting. The little girl, Faye, stood on her tiptoes, leaned into the microphone, and for a long moment, she just looked out into the darkness, saying nothing. The silence stretched on, becoming heavier, more awkward with each passing second. People began to wonder if she was too scared to even begin. Mr. Harrison tapped his pen again, a gesture of impatience. And then, just as he was about to clear his throat, she opened her mouth and a voice, small and trembling, filled the quiet hall. The silence in the auditorium stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, of the faint hum of the lights overhead, of the person next to you shifting in their seat. Faye, the little girl in the pale yellow dress, stood on her tiptoes, her small hands gripping the cool metal of the microphone stand. She leaned in, her mouth just inches from the mesh head, and for a moment that felt like an eternity, she did nothing. She just stared out into the vast dark room, her eyes wide and unblinking. A few people in the back rows started to murmur, a low, restless sound like rustling leaves. Mr. Harrison, the head judge, let out an almost silent sigh of impatience. He had seen this 100 times. Stage fright, the paralyzing fear that turns a confident child into a statue. He picked up his pen, ready to jot down a note about lack of preparation. He was already thinking ahead. mentally composing the gentle but firm words he would offer later. The kind of words that sounded supportive but really meant, "Perhaps this isn't for you." He glanced at Ms. Albright, who gave him a small, encouraging smile. The kind she gave to all the children, no matter their talent. Mr. Evans, the city councilman, had his phone back in his hand, his thumb scrolling silently, his face illuminated by the blue-white light of the screen. And then Faye sang. The first note was thin and fragile, like a thread of smoke in a breeze. It was barely a whisper, and it wavered, pitching slightly flat. Her voice was reedy, lacking the strength or clarity one would hope for in a singer, even a child. The first line of her song was almost lost in the size of the room. "There's a rocking chair on the porch." Her voice cracked on the last word. A few people in the audience chuckled nervously. A father a few rows back patted his teenage son on the knee as if to say, "See? It's okay if you're not perfect." The fidgeting in the seats increased. Someone unwrapped a piece of candy. The crinkle of the plastic wrapper, loud and sharp in the quiet spaces between Faye's words. Mr. Harrison nodded to himself, his pen moving across the scoring sheet. Weak vocal control. Poor pitch. Lacks projection. He was already writing the story of this performance in his head, and it was a very short, very predictable story. Faye continued, her voice still shaky. She sang about the rocking chair, about how it would creak and groan in the wind. The lyrics were simple, almost childlike in their directness. There was no clever wordplay, no complex rhyme scheme. It was just a statement of fact. The song felt less like a performance and more like a list. A list of things. Mr. Harrison found himself growing more impatient. This wasn't just bad. It was boring. He looked at his watch. He wondered what his wife had made for dinner. He hoped it was the leftover lasagna. He took another sip of his lukewarm water, the taste flat and uninteresting. But then, something happened. It wasn't a sudden change, not a lightning strike of talent. It was slower, more subtle, like the way the sky changes color as the sun begins to set. Faye sang the next line, "And his boots were always by the door." On that line, her voice, though still small, found a surprising solidity. It wasn't louder, but it was clearer. The waver was gone. And her eyes, they had been wide with fear, staring into the darkness. Now they seemed to focus. It was as if she was no longer looking at the hundreds of faces in the audience. She was looking through them at something only she could see. Her posture changed too. The slight slump in her shoulders straightened, just a little. She was no longer a frightened child on a big stage. She was a guide, leading everyone to a place in her memory. The shift was so small that most people didn't consciously notice it. But the feeling in the room began to change. The restless energy started to fade away. The person unwrapping the candy stopped. The murmuring in the back died down. Mr. Evans, without looking up from his phone, felt the change in the atmosphere. The noise level had dropped. He slowly lowered his phone, his thumb pausing mid-scroll, and looked toward the stage. He had a slightly annoyed expression, as if to ask why everyone had gotten so quiet. Ms. Albright, the music teacher, was the first to truly understand. She leaned forward in her chair, her elbows on the table. Her gentle, encouraging smile was gone, replaced by a look of intense concentration. She wasn't just hearing the notes anymore. She was listening to the story. She could hear the truth in the little girl's voice. It was a truth that had nothing to do with perfect pitch or stage presence. It was raw and real. Mr. Harrison was the most resistant. He wanted to dismiss it. He wanted to stick to his initial assessment. But he couldn't ignore the change. He stopped writing. His pen hovered over the paper, the ink tip just a fraction of an inch from the cheap cardboard. He watched Faye. He watched the way her hands, which had been clenched into small fists, had relaxed. One hand now rested gently on the microphone stand, as if for comfort rather than support. He found himself listening, really listening to the words. Faye sang about the boots. They were muddy, she said, always caked with dirt from the garden. And they smelled like cut grass and gasoline. It was such a specific sensory detail. Suddenly the audience wasn't just hearing a song. They were smelling the boots. They could picture them, sitting by the back door, a silent testament to a day's work. A man in the third row, a man with calloused hands and a worn-out jacket, slowly reached up and wiped a hand across his face. Not crying, just thinking. He had a pair of boots just like that. The song continued, each line a small, perfect snapshot of a life. She sang about a big, calloused hand that would hold hers, a hand that felt warm and rough, like an old tree root. She sang about a laugh that was loud like a thunderstorm in the summer. The lyrics were simple, but they painted a picture so vivid and so full of love that it was impossible to ignore. The auditorium was no longer a room full of bored spectators waiting for the next act. It was a room full of people leaning in, listening to a story. The air was thick with a quiet, shared emotion. Mr. Harrison felt a strange tightening in his chest. He told himself it was just the stuffy air in the room. He told himself he was just tired. But he knew it was something else. He had spent his life teaching people how to pretend, how to become someone else on stage. He had seen actors cry on command, seen singers pour fake emotion into a song they didn't write. But this was different. This wasn't pretending. This little girl wasn't performing a memory. She was reliving it, right there in front of everyone. And she was pulling them all in with her. He looked over at Ms. Albright. She had tears in her eyes. But she was smiling a sad, beautiful smile. He looked at Mr. Evans. The councilman had put his phone down completely. It was screened down on the table. He was staring at the little girl on stage, his mouth slightly open, his cynical, bored expression completely gone. He looked like a child again, listening to a bedtime story. Faye sang about a promise that he would teach her to ride a bike. The one with the red handlebars, she sang, her voice gaining a haunting resonance that filled the hall. He said he wouldn't let go. In that moment, everyone in the room understood. The boots by the door, the big rough hand, the promise of the bike hit was all part of a past that was gone. The song wasn't just a collection of memories. It was a memorial. The little girl on stage was no longer just a contestant in a talent show. She was a storyteller, a keeper of a precious flame. And the audience, the judges, everyone were no longer just observers. They were witnesses. They were witnesses to a love so pure and a loss so deep that it could only be expressed through the simple, honest voice of a child. The shaky start was forgotten. The off-key notes didn't matter anymore. All that mattered was the story and the little girl who was brave enough to tell it. The performance had truly begun, and no one in that room was prepared for where it would take them. The silence in the auditorium was no longer awkward or empty. It was full. It was a heavy, sacred blanket that had settled over every single person, a shared space of quiet understanding. The little girl Faye stood in the single circle of light. It's no longer a nervous contestant, but a conduit for a story that was unfolding in the hearts of everyone listening. Her voice, which had started as a fragile whisper, had now found a clear, steady path. It wasn't a powerful, trained voice, but it was an honest one, and in that vast, quiet room, honesty was more powerful than any perfect note. She sang about the boots by the door, the hand that felt like a tree root, the promise of the red bike. Each line was a brushstroke, painting a picture of a man who was strong and kind, a man who was deeply loved. The audience was no longer a collection of individuals. They had become a single entity, breathing together, feeling together. A teenager who had been slouched in his seat, looking bored, had now sat up straight, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. A mother in the front row gently pulled her young daughter closer, not because the content was frightening, but because the story was so full of love that it demanded a physical closeness. Then the song took a turn. The memories, which had been so warm and tangible, began to carry a new weight, a subtle shadow of absence. And he wrote me a letter, Faye sang, her voice softening again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from reverence. On paper, that felt thin and blue. She paused, and in that pause, the entire auditorium seemed to lean forward. Mr. Harrison. The head judge was completely still. His pen, which had been poised to deliver a final, dismissive judgment, lay on the table. He wasn't thinking about lasagna anymore. He wasn't thinking about anything at all except the little girl on the stage and the letter she was singing about. He found himself picturing an creased piece of blue airmail paper, the kind that used to fold into its own envelope. "He told me to be good," she continued, her voice gaining a new, heartbreaking clarity. "He told me to help my mom with the chores. He said the dog missed me and that I should give him an extra treat." These were not the grand, poetic words of a song. They were mundane, everyday instructions. But that was what made them so devastating. They were the words of a father who thought he would be coming home. They were the words of a man planning for a future that, for him, would never arrive. A quiet sound rippled through the audience. It was the sound of 100 people swallowing at the same time, a collective lump in 1,000 throats. Miss Albright, music teacher, had her hand pressed to her mouth. Her shoulders were shaking, but she was trying to hold it together, trying to be the professional. But it was a losing battle. A single tear escaped and traced a slow, glistening path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She just let it fall. "I keep it under my pillow," Faye sang, and as she did, she made a small, almost unconscious gesture. She brought one hand to her chest, right over her heart, and held it there. It was a simple movement, but it was as if she were physically holding the memory. The letter, the love, right there inside her. "So his words are the last thing I hear, and the first thing I know when I wake up." That was the moment the first audible sob broke the silence. It came from a woman in the back, a sharp, painful sound that she quickly muffled with her hand. But once it started, it couldn't be stopped. It was like a crack in a dam. Another sob followed, and then another. The rustle of people reaching for tissues, for their partner's hand, for their own sleeve, filled the quiet spaces in the song. Mr. Harrison stared at the stage. His entire career had been built on the idea of performance, on the art of illusion. He had taught students how to cry on cue, how to project emotion they didn't feel. He had seen countless actors deliver powerful monologues about loss and love. But he had never witnessed anything like this. This wasn't a performance. This was an exorcism. The little girl was pouring out a grief so pure, so immense, that it was filling the entire room, seeping into the cracks of every hardened heart, every cynical mind. He looked down at his scoring sheet. The neat, critical notes he had written at the beginning now seemed childish and cruel. He picked up his pen, not to write, but with the unconscious intention of clicking it, a nervous habit he had. But his hand was trembling so much that the pen slipped from his fingers. It fell onto the table with a soft, final clatter, and then rolled onto the floor. He didn't even notice. He just kept staring, his own vision beginning to blur. Faye's voice grew stronger, rising to meet the wave of emotion in the room. She was no longer just singing to them. She was singing for them. She was giving voice to every unshed tear, every unspoken goodbye, every memory held close in the dead of night. "He told me the stars were just holes in the floor of heaven," she sang, her voice soaring with a pure, clear note that seemed to hang in the air, shimmering and beautiful, "so he could peek down and see me." As she sang that line, she tilted her head back and looked up, past the bright lights, past the ceiling of the auditorium, as if she could actually see those holes, those tiny points of light in the floor of heaven. It was a gesture of such profound, childlike faith that it was unbearable. A burly man in a flannel shirt, the kind of man who probably worked with his hands, who looked like he hadn't cried a day in his adult life, lowered his head into his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, racking sobs. The teenager who had been so bored earlier now had his face buried in his mother's shoulder, his body racked with a grief. He was too young to fully understand, but was feeling all the same. The sound of crying was no longer a series of isolated incidents. It had become a soft, collective rain, a current of shared sorrow and empathy that flowed through the entire auditorium. People were no longer ashamed of their tears. They looked at each other, their faces wet and streaked, and saw their own reflection. They were all in this together, bound by the voice of a 7-year-old girl, Mr. Evans. The city councilman sat with his phone face down on the table, completely forgotten. He was staring at Faye, his mouth slightly agape. He had come to this event out of obligation, expecting an evening of tedious mediocrity. Instead, he was being reminded of his own father, of a promise made and broken, of a love that still ached when he let himself think about it. He felt a tear roll down his own cheek and was too stunned, too moved, to even wipe it away. Faye held the last note of the verse, letting it resonate through the room, a single, pure sound of love and loss. The song was building, heading towards its final powerful chorus. The little girl who had walked onto the stage with a smudge of chocolate on her cheek and a worn piece of paper had dismantled the pew minutes, dismantled the defenses of a room full of strangers. She hadn't done it with a show of force or a display of technical skill. She had done it with the truth. And now, 100 grown adults sat weeping in the dark, their hearts laid bare, waiting for her to show them what to do with all this feeling. The air in the auditorium was thick, so heavy with shared emotion that it felt like you could reach out and touch it. The quiet sound of weeping had become a constant, a soft, percussive underscore to the little girl's song. It was no longer a collection of individual sobs. It had merged into a single, collective expression of heartbreak. Faye stood in the spotlight, a small, steady anchor in a sea of overwhelming feeling. The song was building, moving towards its final, powerful conclusion, and every person in the room knew it. They were bracing themselves, holding their breath for the final wave. As she began the final chorus, her voice changed again. It was no longer just clear or steady. It was filled with a new, resonant strength that seemed impossible coming from such a small body. It wasn't the loud, booming power of a trained vocalist. It was the unbreakable strength of a spirit that had been through the fire and came out singing. The notes were pure and full, carrying a weight of love and loss that was almost tangible. When she sang the line about his boots by the door, it wasn't just a memory anymore. It was an anthem for every father who had ever worked hard, every family who had ever waited. The man in the flannel shirt let out a choked gasp, his face buried in his hands, his entire body shaking. He wasn't just seeing a pair of muddy boots. He was seeing his own, and the little girl who waited for him to come home, when she sang about his hand feeling like a tree root. The teenager in the audience reached out and took his mother's hand, holding it tightly. He was thinking of his own father's rough hands, of the way they felt on his shoulder when he was scared. He was understanding, for the first time, that parents were just people, that they had their own fears, and that their love was a real, physical thing you could hold on to. And then she sang the line about the stars. He told me the stars were just holes in the floor of heaven, so he could peek down and see me. This time the line didn't just hang in the air. It shattered something inside everyone who heard it. It was a child's beautiful, heartbreaking logic, a way of making sense of the unbearable. Ms. Albright, the music teacher, was no longer trying to hold back her tears. They flowed freely, and she didn't care. She was a teacher, and all she could think about was the incredible, painful bravery of this child to take the worst thing that could ever happen and turn it into something so beautiful it could break a room full of strangers. But it was Mr. Harrison, the head judge, the man who had seen it all, who was experiencing the most profound transformation. He sat frozen in his chair, his face a mask of disbelief and raw, unguarded sorrow. The professional facade, the cynical armor he had built up over decades of watching mediocre performances, had been completely obliterated. A hot, shameful tear traced a path down his wrinkled cheek, and he didn't wipe it away. He felt like a fraud. He had spent his life teaching people how to pretend, how to use technique and trickery to simulate emotion. He had written books on stagecraft, on the art of the performance. But this little girl, with her simple song and her honest voice, had shown him that he knew nothing at all. She wasn't performing. She was testifying. And he felt like he was on trial, and he had been found wanting. He thought of his own father, a man he had never been able to connect with, a man whose funeral he had attended with a dry, stoic face. He had never allowed himself to feel this kind of grief, this kind of pure, unadulterated love and loss. And now, here it was, being given to him by a 7-year-old girl, and it was tearing him apart. His shoulders began to shake, and a low, guttural sob escaped his lips. a sound so foreign to him that it startled him back to a state of semi-awareness. Faye held the last note of the chorus. It wasn't a long, dramatic, showy note. It was simple and pure, and it seemed to absorb all the light and all the sound in the room. It was a single, perfect sound of love. And then it was gone. The silence that followed was the most profound silence the auditorium had ever known. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was a heavy, sacred space filled with the echoes of what had just been sung. No one moved. No one clapped. No one breathed. It was as if the entire room was frozen in a single, perfect, heartbreaking moment. Hundreds of people sat in the dark, tears streaming down their faces, their hearts laid bare. They were all thinking of someone, a father they had lost, a child they needed to protect, a love they had taken for granted. The little girl on the stage had given them a gift, the gift of feeling, and they were all lost in it. The spell was finally broken by a small, almost imperceptible sound. It was the sound of Mr. Evans, the city councilman, letting out a long, shaky breath. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for 5 minutes and could finally breathe again. That single sound was like a starting pistol. A woman in the front row let out a soft whimper. The man in the flannel shirt wiped his face with the back of his hand and sniffled loudly, and then it started. It wasn't a wave of applause. It was a single clap. It came from Ms. Albright. She was still crying, but she was clapping too. It was a slow, deliberate clap, full of reverence and respect. Then another person joined in, and another. It started as a soft, scattered patter, like the first few drops of a rainstorm. But then it began to build. It grew louder and faster, a rolling tide of sound that was fueled not by politeness or entertainment, but by a desperate, emotional need to show gratitude. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted. It wasn't just applause. It was a thunderous emotional release. The sound was deafening, a physical force that shook the very foundations of the old building. People were on their feet, every single one of them. They were clapping and cheering and crying, their faces turned toward the small figure on the stage. They were not just applauding a performance. They were thanking her. They were thanking her for her bravery, for her honesty, for reminding them of what it means to love and to lose. Faye stood blinking in the sudden roaring storm of sound and light. The brave storyteller who had held them all in the palm of her hand was gone. In her place was a shy, slightly overwhelmed little girl. The sound was so loud, so unexpected, that it seemed to frighten her. She took a small step back, her eyes wide with surprise. She looked out at the standing, weeping, cheering crowd, and she didn't understand. She had just sung a song. It was a song she sang to herself sometimes when she missed her dad. She didn't know it could do this. She gave a small, awkward bow, a clumsy dip of her knees that was more of a curtsy. It was an endearing, completely unprofessional gesture that only made the crowd love her more. Then, as if the noise and the attention were too much for her to bear, she turned and scurried off the stage. Disappearing into the darkness of the wings, the applause continued for a long time, even after she was gone. It was a roar that refused to die down, a sound that would echo in the memory of everyone in that room for a very long time. On stage, the announcer, a woman who had seen countless talent shows, stood frozen in the wings, her own face streaked with tears. She knew she had to go out and introduce the next act, but she couldn't. How could you follow that? How could you possibly ask a magician or a dancer to come out after that? Back at the judges' table, the three of them sat in stunned silence. Mr. Evans was slowly shaking his head, as if trying to clear it. Ms. Albright was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, a look of profound awe on her face. And Mr. Harrison just stared at the empty stage, his pen still on the floor where it had fallen. He was a broken man, but in the best possible way. The cynical, jaded drama teacher was gone, replaced by a humble man who had just been reminded of the true, transformative power of art. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had just witnessed the most important performance of his life, and there was nothing to judge. There was only this, a profound, heartbreaking, beautiful silence that followed a perfect, imperfect song, asterisk, the thunderous roar of the auditorium seemed to go on forever. A physical force that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the bones of everyone present. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated emotion, a tidal wave of gratitude and shared grief. But even the loudest storms eventually pass. The clapping began to slow, the cheers softened to sniffles, and the vast, dark room settled back into a state of quiet contemplation. The air was still thick, still electric, but the energy had shifted from explosive to reverent. Backstage, in the cluttered, gray-balled corridor, the world was a different kind of loud. Faye had burst through the heavy black curtains and ran straight into the arms of her mother, a woman with tired eyes and a gentle smile who had been waiting anxiously in the wings. The little girl buried her face in her mother's coat, her small body trembling. "Mommy, they were so loud," she whispered, her voice muffled by the fabric. "Why were they so loud?" Her mother held her tight, rocking her gently from side to side. She could feel the rapid, thumping beat of her daughter's heart against her own. She looked over Faye's head, toward the stage, where the faint light still spilled out, and she could hear the sound of the crowd slowly settling. She had heard the song, of course. She had heard it 100 times before, sung softly in their living room, hummed under Faye's breath as she played with her toys. But she had never heard it like that. She had never felt it fill a room and break the hearts of strangers because they listened. "Sweetie," her mother said, her voice thick with an emotion she was trying to keep in check for her daughter's sake. "They really, really listened." Faye pulled back, her face a mask of confusion. "But it was just my song. About Dad?" "I know, baby," her mother said, smoothing back the unruly brown hair from her daughter's forehead. And it was the most beautiful song in the world. She kissed the top of her head, a long, lingering kiss filled with all the love and pride and sadness in her heart. For her, the performance wasn't a spectacle. It was a sacred act, a public sharing of a private love. She felt fiercely protective of this moment, of the little girl who had been brave enough to stand up there and give away a piece of her father's memory on stage. The announcer stood frozen at the side of the curtain, her own cheeks streaked with tears. She had a clipboard in her hand with the name of the next act, a juggling duo, but the paper felt impossibly heavy. She looked out at the audience, a sea of damp, upturned faces. And then she looked toward the judges' table, her eyes pleading for guidance. What do you do after that? How do you introduce a man who is about to throw bowling pins in the air after a little girl has just caught lightning in a bottle? The answer came from an unexpected source. Mr. Harrison, the head judge, pushed his chair back. The legs scraped against the floor with a loud, decisive sound that cut through the quiet. He stood up, a man who looked years older than he had just an hour ago, shoulders slumped, his face etched with a profound and humbling sorrow. He ignored the scoring sheets on the table, ignored the half-full bottle of water, ignored everything except the microphone at the center of the stage. He walked toward it with a slow, deliberate gait, a man walking to his own judgment. He reached the microphone and tapped it once. The feedback squealed through the speakers, making a few people wince. He leaned in, his hands gripping the stand for support. For a long moment, he just stood there, looking out at the crowd. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He cleared his throat, a rough, painful sound. The old Mr. Harrison, the polished, cynical drama teacher, was gone. In his place was a man who had been stripped bare. He began, his voice cracking. He stopped, took a deep breath, and tried again. There is nothing to judge here." His voice was shaky, unprofessional, but it was filled with a raw honesty that connected with every person in the room. A wave of nods rippled through the audience. "I have spent my entire life, my entire career, teaching people how to pretend, how to show you something that isn't real. And tonight a 7-year-old child just taught me what is real." Paused, his gaze sweeping across the darkened rows of faces. He saw the burly man in the flannel shirt, the teenager with his mother, the woman with the tear-streaked makeup. He saw himself in all of them. "What we just witnessed was not a performance in the way we understand it," he continued, his voice growing a little stronger, a little steadier. "It was a gift. It was a memory. It was love. Pure and simple. And it was an honor to be here to receive it. He looked toward the wings in the direction where Faye had disappeared. So, there will be no score. There will be no critique. There is only this. Thank you. Thank you to that young lady for sharing her father with us. He stepped back from the microphone, his brief, impromptu speech over. He didn't wait for applause. He simply turned and walked back to his seat, a man who had just publicly admitted he knew nothing, and in doing so, had shown he understood everything. The audience remained silent for a moment, and then a new wave of applause began, softer this time, more respectful. It was an applause for Mr. Harrison, for his honesty, and for the way he had given voice to their own feelings, the announcer. Seeing her cue finally walked back onto the stage, she took a deep breath, her professional composure slowly returning. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice still a little shaky, "I think we could all use a moment. Let's take a short 10-minute intermission to collect ourselves. We will resume the show shortly." It was a wise decision. The audience let out a collective sigh of relief. People began to stand, stretching their legs, talking in hushed, reverent tones. They weren't discussing the technical merits of the song. They were sharing their own stories. "That's how I felt when my dad passed," a man whispered to his friend. "It made me call my own father, just to tell him I love him," a young woman said into her phone. The song had become a catalyst, a spark that had ignited 1,000 personal fires of memory and reflection. The other contestants waiting in the wings were not upset. They, too, had been watching from the sidelines. The teenage guitarist from the Thunderbolts was looking at his own father in the crowd with a new appreciation, new understanding. The magician was quietly folding up his silks, a look of deep thought on his face. They all understood that something special had happened, something that transcended the idea of a competition. When the show resumed, the atmosphere was different. It was lighter, but also more subdued. The remaining acts performed with a new kind of humility, and the audience received them with a new kind of warmth. But everyone knew the real winner of the night. Finally, it was time for the awards. The announcer came back to the stage, holding a small, golden trophy. It was a cheap, generic thing, a plastic cup on a marble base, but tonight it felt like a sacred object. "And now," she said, her voice clear and strong, "the moment we've all been waiting for. The winner of this year's Community Talent Show." Mr. Harrison walked back to the microphone. He had asked to do this. He stood there for a moment, looking out at the expectant faces. "There are many talented people here tonight," he said. "But there is one who gave us something more than talent. She gave us truth." He looked toward the wings. "Faye, could you and your mother please come to the stage?" Faye, who had been sitting on her mother's lap backstage, looked up with wide eyes. Her mom gave her a gentle nudge. "Go on, sweetie. They want to see you." Hand in hand, they walked out onto the stage. The audience erupted again, not with the overwhelming emotional storm from before, but with a warm, loving wave of applause. Faye looked out at the lights and the faces, and this time she didn't look scared. She just looked curious. Her mother stood beside her, a protective hand on her shoulder. Mr. Harrison knelt down on one knee, bringing himself to Faye's level. It was a simple gesture, but it was incredibly powerful. He held out the trophy. "Faye," he said, his voice soft and kind, "this is a prize. But it's not a very good prize, is it? Not for what you gave us." He looked into her clear, innocent eyes. "The real prize was the song. The real prize was remembering. So you can take this if you want. It's shiny, and it's yours. But I want you to know something. You didn't just sing a song tonight. You helped a lot of people remember someone they love. And you helped a grumpy old man remember why he loves art in the first place. So thank you." He placed the trophy in her small hands. Faye looked down at it, turning it over in her fingers. It was heavy and it glinted in the light. She looked back up at Mr. Harrison, a small, shy smile playing on her lips. She didn't say anything. She just held the trophy. Later, as they walked to the car, the cool night air felt refreshing after the stuffy warmth of the auditorium. Faye held her mother's hand with one hand and the trophy with the other. She swung it gently, watching it catch the light from the street lamps. Mommy, she said, her voice sleepy. Yes, sweetie? Can we get ice cream? Her mother laughed, a real, genuine laugh that felt like the sun coming out after a long rain. Yes, baby. We can definitely get ice cream. They walked on in comfortable silence, the trophy swinging back and forth, a small, golden symbol of a night that had changed everything and nothing at all. For the world, a little girl had become a brief, shining star. But for her mother, she was just Faye, a little girl with a song in her heart and a smudge of chocolate on her cheek, who had reminded a room full of strangers that the most powerful thing in the world is not a perfect performance, but a perfect love.